this is Yana Smakula for SimonsSaysStamp.com. Welcome back for another Yippee for Yana video. In this episode, I'm sharing an easy and messy watercolor floral card for Mother's Day using some older goodies from Simon Says Stamp. I know how much you enjoy watching tutorials using not only new but also older products, so I'm hoping you will find this video useful. The main stamp set I'm using today is the Sketched Flowers 6x8 clear stamp set by Simon Says Stamp. And here I have it already mounted on the lid of my MISTI stamping tool. I also have a Happy Mother's Day sentiment from another stamp set called Mom's Flowers, also by Simon. You'll later see me use a sub-sentiment from here, another sentiment for the inside of the card, and also a coordinating die from this set. I want to do simple and messy watercoloring. I want it to look gorgeous, but I also want it to be easy to make. I'm all about easy, so whenever I see something or want to do something, I'll try and look for the easiest way to do it. I've started working on this card by prepping cardstock for heat embossing. I want to heat emboss image outlines to simplify the watercoloring. When I have raised outlines to my images, I find that I can watercolor faster as I'm not as afraid to go outside the lines. The embossed lines of my image help me stay inside the image boundaries. The paper that I'm using today is actually not a watercolor paper. It is regular cardstock. This is Neenah Desert Storm 80-pound cardstock. I picked this paper for my card today because I wanted my watercoloring to have a non-white background to it. But I didn't really want to spend time coloring the background itself. And I've done it in the past. I would color the images themselves and then would come in and color the background to whatever color I wanted. Results are usually phenomenal, but this is also a very time-consuming process. A way around it is to use a colored paper right away. Now, this doesn't always work, but it does work in many cases. While I was explaining my reasoning, I've already stamped the images on this paper. I covered them with Hero Art's Detail White Embossing Powder. Next, I'm stamping same floral cluster again, but on the other side of the panel. I want to have flowers covering most of the front panel of my card, leaving a small gap to house the sentiment. The top image was stamped in the corner, so I still have a big gap on the right-hand side to fill in, and to do that I'm using single images from this same stamp set and just stamping them one by one using a clear block and clear embossing ink. Once I have all of the images stamped, I'm going to cover everything with the same white detail embossing powder and heat set it all at once so there's minimal warping to this panel. Now comes the most fun part, the coloring. Similar to my previous Simon Says Stamp video, I'm going to use my Danielle Smith watercolors. I have them in a custom watercolor palette with my favorite colors. And also, again, to make it easier to color, I'm going to use a water brush. You would think that watercolor would not show or would not work on this craft paper, but in fact, it does work beautifully on this paper. Yes, the colors are not as vibrant and as saturated as they would have been on white. The craft color of the paper does dull some of the colors, but watercoloring on craft still works, and it works beautifully for what I have in mind for this card. I started by coloring leaves, and here I used Serpentine Genuine and also sap green color for some shading. Next, I started with quinacridone coral, but later decided to go with pink and switch to the quinacridone rose color. You can see I tried to blot some of that coral color away. The trick to coloring on non-watercolor paper is using very little water. This kind of paper is not designed to take and hold water, so you need to go easy on the amount of water you add with your watercolors. Using a water brush here helps me as I know exactly how much water is coming out, and I can control the amount of water to make sure I'm not letting too much out and I'm not oversaturating my paper. In addition to the colors I already mentioned, I also used Imperial Purple, although this is one of the colors that turned muddy here. I didn't like the shade of purple that I was getting. Even after I added more pigment to the paper, it still looked wrong to me. Usually this color is much more vibrant and is much more prettier. So in the end, you will see me color over these flowers using a phthalo turquoise color. And these flowers will end up being dark blue with a faint green tint to them. So be prepared. Either test each color you plan to use on a scrap piece of identical paper, or be ready to cover up and fix your mistakes and use different colors as you go. For the yellow flowers, I used mostly cadmium yellow medium and quinacridone gold. I also later added some shading using the quinacridone deep gold color. Finally, I moved on to coloring the other flower shape, and for this one, I used the most vibrant pink color I have in my collection, which is the opera pink. It actually is almost like neon pink, very vibrant and always gorgeous. Once the initial layer of the color was dry, I came back to my card front and added some shading to many of the flowers using either a darker color or a more saturated version of the color used previously. At this point, I actually wasn't thrilled with the results, and I even considered tossing this and starting over. But I decided to keep working on this piece to see if I could make it so that I loved it in the end, and I actually did. After finishing this coloring, I once again let it dry and next added a generous spritz of the Hero Arts Iridescent Shimmer Mist. This is number one step to making a watercolor piece look messy. I don't always favor the messy look, but if I watercolor something and it looks like it's missing something, or if I need to disguise some imperfections, I always add this splatter. Next, I use some white acrylic paint. I have a little bit here on the clear block. I diluted it with water and also splattered onto the card rather heavily. Sometimes this is very scary to do, especially if your coloring is impeccable. You might think that you will ruin your piece, and I do have those thoughts as well. And I often skip adding splatter in cases like that. But in this case, where my watercoloring wasn't what I had hoped it would be, I think adding splatter was the right choice. In a way, it kind of fixed my watercoloring and made the panel look what I wanted it to be. At this point, I felt like the sentiment was lost on this card, so I decided to use the coordinating die from the Mom's Flowers stamp set and die cut the word Mom into this panel. My plan was to inlay it back, but with the help of thin foam adhesive to pop it up just a tad on the card. I first adhered the panel onto the card base itself, and next I used scrapbook adhesive's thin foam adhesive sheets. I die cut another word Mom and adhered the die cut Mom over it. You can see it's dimensional, but it's not as dimensional as with regular foam adhesive. It's actually very thin, maybe 1 millimeter thick. I inlaid it back into the background and added the negative piece from the letter O back into the background to make it look solid. The word Mom here is actually nearly invisible, and that's the look I wanted to get. I didn't want that die cut word to be too prominent on the card. Next, I white heat embossed a sub-sentiment on a strip of hot pink cardstock and foam mounted that onto the card under my Mother's Day sentiment. Finally, I thought I would outline the die cut letters to help them stand out at least a little bit on the card. The coordinating stamp is a solid one, and while I could have used this stamp, it would have been very easy to do, I didn't really want to have a solid stamping on these letters. I only wanted to have an outline. So I drew an outline myself using a white pen. This ended up looking like the Mom outline was positioned under all of the florals on the background as if it was masked. Now, the messiness of this card disguised any of the imperfect hand-drawn lines on the word Mom and helped them blend and become a part of the design. Had this been a clean watercolored card, I probably would not have drawn these lines myself, as I would have been too afraid to mess it up. I also used a few sequins from my stash to add some sparkle to the card front, and finally stamped another message on the inside of the card. This is something I rarely do, but I'm trying to do it more often. I hope you guys will give this idea a try. If you do make a card inspired by this video, you know the drill. We'd love it if you shared your project online and tagged us on social media. We always enjoy seeing what you guys are making. Be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Simon Says Stamp YouTube channel if you haven't yet done so. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you next time. Bye!